All right, guys, chapter 3 here. And we can see right off the bat that the apocalypticism of this graphic novel is heating up from this fallout shelter image right here. This is a pretty heavy chapter, as we'll see, continuing in a line of pretty heavy chapters, and we'll see there are more heavy chapters to come. But our goal, as always, is to kind of do a close reading of the text, figure out what the main themes are and the main techniques that Alan Moore is using to convey these ideas, especially in terms of the relationship between the visuals and the textual elements of this comic book. And hopefully you can appreciate that the layers and levels are really deepening here in terms of having a comic book within a comic book, having multiple scenes all occurring simultaneously. Alan Moore is doing a lot of either parallelism or symmetry, as well as kind of inverted or ironic inversions within this chapter that I think really add a lot and really are something that could only exist within the comic book genre. So, right off the bat, chapter 3, what is this chapter about? I'm going to argue that the main theme that we're going to be discussing is about a sense of cosmic isolation, and the ambiguity, more particularly, of the question of theodicy. I know that right now that was probably a mouthful, but the core idea that we're going to be exploring is there a higher power watching out for humanity? If there is a God, if there is some divine plan, why does that God allow for evil things to happen? Why would that God let humanity get to the point where they are on the verge of annihilating themselves through atomic weapons? If God was good and all-powerful and all-caring about humanity, why would he let atrocities like the Holocaust happen? And we're going to see this question, the question of theodicy, as it is called, leads to more profound philosophical conclusions about the potential that humanity is cosmically isolated, that we are alone, that we are in a universe without any higher power watching over us, or if there is a higher power watching over us, we can't possibly understand that higher power and why that higher power would let such terrible things happen. So that's kind of the overview idea. We'll see how this applies, and more importantly, we're going to see how I got to this conclusion, because as always, we want to make sure that our conclusions are derived from an analysis of the text as opposed to starting with a conclusion and forcing our evidence to meet it. So, right off the bat, we see a fallout shelter here. You all should be familiar with this. But even from the opening panel, we see some brilliant artistry on Alan Moore's part, right? This fallout shelter is just being put up in the background here. Obviously, we find out by the end of the chapter that the atomic situation has heated up as Russia invades Afghanistan once Dr. Manhattan leaves, which puts the U.S. on hair-trigger nuclear alert. And the newspaper vendor here right off the bat says we ought to nuke Russia and let God sort it out. So clearly, the relationship between this text box and the actual image in the background is obviously that of this sense of apocalypticism through nuclear weapons, right? The newspaper vendor saying we ought to nuke Russia. Obviously, the sign in the background is a warning of the potential fallout that could happen if the U.S. were to nuke Russia. Also notice the immediate note of a God or a higher power. Let a higher power bring justice to what the newspaper sees as being the evil communists. And now let's look up at the Black Freighter panel. And what does it say here? It says, "Delirious, I saw that hellbound ship's black sails against the yellow Indian sky and knew again the stench of powder and men's brains and war." So just to summarize the literal level, this narrator, the Black Freighter, looks up and sees this pirate ship, the Black Freighter's hellbound black sails against a yellow sky. If you're paying close attention, notice that the zoom up on this particular fallout sign looks like a pirate ship. It looks like a very abstract ship, obviously, but you can see if I turn on my mouse here, you can see the black prow here. Right? That's kind of like the sails. That's the ship. And then you have the yellow sky in the background. So notice all the parallelism that's going on here, even in this opening moment. Let's continue with the Black Freighter. It says, "The heads nailed to its prow looked down, those with eyes. Goal-eaten, salt-caked, liplessly mouthing, no use, all's lost. The waves about me were scarlet, foaming horribly warm, yet still the freighter's hideous crew called out, 'More blood, more blood.'" So, okay, this isn't very great, right? Clearly, the Black Freighter is massacring them. That's why the water is scarlet. That's why they're foaming. They clearly are bloodthirsty. And then right here it says, again, just looking at the Black Freighter for now, Its tar-streaked hull rolled over me. In despair, I sank beneath those foul pink billows, offering up my wretched soul to Almighty God, His mercy, His judgment. So right there, we can see the immediate parallel to the theme that I'm going to argue is central to this chapter, which is about whether or not there's a higher power looking out for us. And clearly here, there is a key idea from the narrator, the Black Freighter, at this point, that he's going to offer up his soul to the Almighty God. And we see the parallel to the title of the chapter, The Judge of All the Earth, which we'll see is a biblical reference. But clearly the question that is being asked is whether there is an Almighty God who's looking over us and going to protect us when terrible things happen. But now let's see the parallels to what the newspaper vendor is saying. Newspaper is saying we ought to nuke Russia and let God sort it out. Notice he's kind of like the Black Freighter crew calling for more blood, more blood. And he says, I see the signs, read the headlines, look things in a face, you know? I'm a news vendor, goddammit. I'm informed on the situation. We ought to nuke them till they glow. And hopefully you should be seeing the parallels here. Notice, interestingly, some little weird clues here. It says missing writer, Castro to blame, ? So there's a missing writer there. Also notice over here it says how sick is Dick, so talking about Richard Nixon after third presidential hard up. So clearly he has been the presidential or the president for 3 terms now. Again, different timeline we're living in. And so obviously, guys, hopefully you're seeing that there's a ton of parallelism going on here, a ton of little clues going on. And what I really want to draw you to is the way in which Alan Moore is kind of layering these things together, that the bloodthirstiness of the Black Freighter crew is paralleled with the newspaper vendor's call for needing to nuke Russia, as this little kid is just reading the Black Freighter comic. Let's keep going. Again, I'm going to read the Black Freighter first. Let's make sure we understand it, and then we can connect it to the newspaper vendor. It says, waking from nightmare, I found myself upon a dismal beachhead amongst dead men and the pieces of dead men. Bosun Ridley lay nearby. Birds were eating his thoughts and his memories. Reader, take comfort from this. In hell, at least, the gulls are contented. So, all right, narrator, the Black Freighter, wakes up, and all his shipmates are dead around him. The pirates had murdered them. His friend Bosun Ridley is laying nearby. Notice the contrast with the ironic inversion of what the newspaper vendor is saying. In this middle panel, he says, listen, I see every goddamn front page in the world. I absorb information. I miss nothing. Now, clearly, as a newspaper vendor is saying that he is missing no knowledge, that he is getting access to all knowledge, that is contrasted or inverted with the Bosun Ridley note that that the birds are eating his brains. He clearly is absorbing nothing because the birds are eating his brains, which are his thoughts and memories. And he says, for instance, the newspaper vendor, right-hand corner, the more disasters happen, the more papers I sell. Explain that. As he's talking about the way in which people seem to feed on disaster, the Black Freighter is talking about the ways in which the gulls are feeding on the disaster of the dead carcasses. Newspaper vendor says, see, everything's connected. A newspaper vendor understands that. He don't retreat from reality. So as a newspaper vendor is saying he will courageously confront the horrors of the world that are being presented in the newspaper, notice what the Black Freighter says. Black Freighter says, for my part, I begged that they should take my eyes, thus sparing me from further horrors. The Black Freighter narrator wants to retreat from the realities of the world because they're so horrific. He can't bear to look at the atrocities that can occur within our world. So again, an ironic inversion. And now we get the zoom up on what for me is really a sad and tragic image. You can see here, I think it conveys it really well. Black Freighter narrator says unheeded, right? So he is not being heeded being given attention. I stood in the surf and wept, unable to bear my circumstances. So notice, this looking up at the sky, I think, could be figuratively associated with these questions of theodicy that we're beginning to ask, right? Who is not heeding him? Clearly some sort of higher power, right? He stood in the surf all alone, not being paid attention to, unable to bear the horrific circumstances. And let's keep going. So as the narrator of the Black Freighter is saying he can't bear his circumstances, the newspaper vendor says the opposite. He says the weight of the world's on him, the newspaper vendor. But does he quit? Nah. He's like Atlas. He can take it. Atlas being the god that was doomed for all of eternity to have to carry the earth on his shoulder, a symbol of a tremendous burden. And then, of course, the newspaper vendor says he's a survivor, speaking about himself, about the newspaper vendor. Clearly, he's talking about a figurative version of a survivor, but as we're seeing here, we're zooming up on a literal survivor. So guys, obviously, hopefully you're seeing the depth and brilliance of what's going on in terms of the artistry and the layering of texts and comics within comics and images. All of this, I think, is so brilliant. And obviously, if I were to continue to go with this type of depth, this would end up being a 3-hour video. But I want to bring your attention to this level of artistic detail that is going on here. I mean, this is how we can tell that this is much more than just your typical kind of Marvel comic book. So let's keep going. It's like this afternoon, says the newspaper vendor. Nova Express, so this is clearly a newspaper, is holding its front page, so no delivery till tonight. A catastrophe, but I coped. So now we know that the reason Nova Express was holding its front page delivery until night was because they wanted to wait until after the interview with Dr. Manhattan. Doug Roth, the person who conducts the interview, was part of Nova Express, is a reporter on behalf of that newspaper. So as the newspaper vendor is talking about coping, we see that the narrator, the Black Freighter, is now talking about his coping. He says, eventually tears ceased. My misfortunes were small. I was alive. And then newspaper vendor says, news vendors always cope. They're indestructible. They thrive on disaster. And then notice the Black Freighter says, and I knew that life had no worse news to offer me. So as newspaper vendors saying they're indestructible, we thrive on disaster, i.e. they can't be killed. And as the as the Black Freighter narrator says that life had no worse news, you see here an ominous sign of the end is nigh guy, the not-so-science guy. Again, another apocalyptic reference of the potential annihilation of the human race. Okay, so let's keep going. I'll now start skipping on past. Notice he's reading the New Frontiersmen. We don't know much about the New Frontiersmen yet. It is a different journal. We'll find out that the Nova Express is more aligned with left or liberal views, and the New Frontiersmen is more aligned with extreme right views. We'll see they're kind of like what's it called? Like an info war. They sort of have conspiracy theory stuff going on there. So anyways, let's keep going. Obviously some funny stuff, right? The man says, it'll happen today. I've seen signs. National Examiner reported a 2-headed cat born in Queens. Today for certain. He's talking about the end of the world. And then he says, but you'll keep my paper for me tomorrow. Obviously kind of a joke, because why would he get the paper if the world's going to end? Let's return to the Black Freighter. I had a sudden memory of clinging fast to someone through the tempest. The figurehead lay at my feet, blindfolded. By seaweed alone upon that dreadful shore, she smiled. So we find out the narrator of the Black Freighter survived by holding on to that masthead, that figurehead that's at the front part of boats. So as their boat was destroyed, he just held on to that. I made to take the ribbon of kelp from off her painted eyes, then thought better of it, not wishing her to suffer the terrible distraction of that grim tide line. It was all I could do for her, though she had borne me through seas of blood, though her cold wooden breast had nourished me in the heart of the storm. Her damp embrace had prevented me from drifting beyond reach, yet this small comfort was all I could offer her. So, all right, your figurative hats should be on here, and the little dinger in your brain that goes off when you start seeing figurative symbols should be ringing quite loud right now. Why? Clearly, he's talking about the horrors of understanding this world, a world that allows such horrific atrocities to occur, and a preference for keeping the metaphorical kelp over our eyes as opposed to seeing the world for what it is, right? A world where horrific things can happen for seemingly no reason. So this is setting up quite well, again, the questions of theodicy that we're going to see more clearly established very soon here. And notice, again, great transition. Then, as the narrator of the Black Freighter is saying, this was all I could give to this figurehead, to this woman, obviously not a real woman. This is the best I could offer her. And then he says, I could not love her as she loved me. We see Laurie here with Dr. Manhattan attempting to love her, but obviously doing so unsuccessfully. And we find out that Laurie is a big fan of the Blue Man Group, if you know what I'm saying. So obviously, Dr. Manhattan, this is establishing very clearly that he does not know how to connect on an emotional or intimate level with humans anymore. As he's having intercourse with Lori, he does this creepy thing where he splits himself into two. Turns out he's also doing a science experiment in the other room. Clearly, she is upset. Clearly, he is not doing a good job of paying attention to her deeper emotional needs. And this has clearly been a long-standing thing. It wasn't just this event when she says, "Shut up, I hate you." It's clear that she has been bottling up these emotions for a long time. And this gives us a transition as we get Lori being angry at Dr. Manhattan's inability to connect to humanity. We get a nice little transition here to John's previous girlfriend, Janie Slater. And says, you can see here in the lower right-hand corner, she begins talking and says, "I remember soon after he failed to prevent JFK's assassination, we argued. I say, John, you know how every damn thing in this world fits together except people." And you can see here the image in the background is paralleling this quite nicely as he fits this broken beaker back together, but is unable to know how to fix his relationship with Lori. We see here Janie Slater clearly not in great shape, and she's saying that he couldn't relate to me, not emotionally, certainly not sexually. Within 3 years, he had dumped me for some 16-year-old who ran around in her underwear. And now notice, again, the inversion or the parallelism going on here. One day he'll find out. He'll find out what it feels like. And we see here that he is finding out what it feels like as Lori's leaving. "I see. So, Mrs. Slater, how do you feel now that you've learned about your condition?" And she says, bitter as hell. "I started smoking 3 packs a day. I mean, I have no illusions. I mean, no one's going to miss me after I'm gone. No one's going to miss me. I know that, especially not him." But now we're seeing, the inversion that Lori is not going to miss Dr. Manhattan, that she is leaving him behind as opposed to the other way around. But Janie's key argument here, guys, is that he doesn't care. He doesn't have to get old, right? He seems unable to connect with a core aspect of the human experience, and we'll explore this in much greater depth in Chapter 4, which is Dr. Manhattan's origin chapter. But the key thing that I would argue one of the key aspects of the human experience that Dr. Manhattan does not have is the experience of time, right? The experience of aging. Clearly, that is very different for him, and we'll see why. So let's keep going. Hopefully, again, picking up on more stuff. And as she continued, as she starts coughing, the reporter says, "It's okay, Miss Slater. If you want, we can stop here." And notice in the background, you see an advertisement for a form of cologne, nostalgia, or perfume by Vite. All right, so we're getting a Vite call out. But notice, again, the parallelism here. Nostalgia is about stopping insofar as you're not moving forward anymore. You're just looking to the past. So all kinds of great connections here. Treasure Island, obviously, a nice little pirate reference, so on and so forth. So hopefully you guys are picking up on all this stuff. Let's keep going. As in the panel on the right-hand side here in the middle, it says, "No, I won't. Not after what he did to me. Some things, once they're busted, they can't ever be fixed." And you can see here this repairman literally fixing a busted door that Rorschach had broken in Night Owl's house. And as Janie Slater in this lower right-hand corner panel says, "It's such a relief just to talk to somebody," we see Lori coming in just to talk to Dan. So lots of parallelism here, guys. Even in this panel in the upper left-hand corner, notice that the guy's back says Gordian Knot Lock Company. What is the Gordian Knot? Well, this was famous legend that the Gordian Knot was a knot that was impossible to untie, and the way that it was finally solved was Alexander the Great came, and the way he broke the Gordian Knot was by just slashing through it through his sword. So usually a symbol of either something that is impossible to solve or Alexander the Great cutting through it being a good symbol of needing to come up with outside-of-the-box solutions to problems that seem inherently insolvable. And so Dan here says, "It's good to see you. Sorry about this mess. I'm having a new lock fitted." And clearly, Lori's in a mess. And the Gordian knot here, I think, is a good symbol for kind of the mess that everyone seems to be getting in, but especially Lori, right? Is her relationship with Dan her relationship with Dr. Manhattan like a Gordian knot that is unsolvable, so on and so forth. Okay. So we are going through, we're just finding out some more detailed stuff. We find out that Lori feels isolated. She feels alone. She doesn't really know anybody. Her relationship isn't working out so great. some good reveals about Dr. Manhattan in this middle panel here. It says the way he looks at things, like he can't remember what they are and doesn't particularly care. This world, the real world, to him, it's like walking through mist, and all the people are like shadows. So you can see this very sad image of Dr. Manhattan. Right after his girlfriend, his most serious relationship of multiple years, walks out on him, he seems completely emotionally unmoved. And you see that mist being paralleled here in the steam of the coffee maker. Just shadows in the fog, as you see that fog. And it says, tonight, right? I walked out after 20 years, and you know what I bet he's doing? His big emotional reaction? He's either smartening up for his TV interview or watching quarks get stuck to gluinos. Maybe both. And so Dan's like, so where will you go? Do you have any place to stay tonight? And she says, yeah, well, I guess I'll splash out on some overnight accommodation and think things through. Just a hotel or someplace normal. And as she says somewhere normal, you see an image of something very not normal, right? Of Dr. Manhattan moving his clothes with his mind. And so she says, Dan, I'm sorry, I've just turned up in hysterics when you were probably about to dress for going up. And he says, listen, I just wish you'd drop in more often. As for tonight, I'm only calling on Hollis, and he doesn't care how people dress. So as Dan is talking about Hollis not caring how people dress, we see Dr. Manhattan, who typically isn't dressed, becoming dressed, but not caring about people. Again, a nice little ironic inversion. So hopefully you guys are seeing these techniques. This is probably the chapter where I will catalog these techniques in the greatest detail. I'll probably start skipping over more and more of them as we move on, just for the interest of things being a little more expedited. I think this middle panel right here sums up that Gordian knot idea I was getting at, where he says, sometimes I look at myself, Laurie says, sometimes I look at myself and think, how did everything get so tangled up? And so on and so forth. All right, you're getting the ideas. So we could keep going on, right? As the Gordian knot locksmith and Dan Dryberg are talking, he says, what happened to your lock, by the way? You get robbed? And Dan says, no, friend, he called when I wasn't expecting him. Gordian knot guy says, I got buddies like that, always turning up drunk completely out of the blue. Obviously, as Dr. Manhattan literally appears out of the blue and is also blue. So, pretty obvious stuff here, guys. Pretty obvious stuff. So, let's keep going. More parallels. Let's try to not get into any tight corners. In this right-hand middle panel, says the Secret Service agent to Dr. Manhattan, play it cool, don't reveal anything, as obviously Laurie and Dan are getting into a tight corner. He turns himself darker for the TV, and they say, my God, well, yes, that's just perfect. That's certainly dark enough for my purposes. Now, obviously, that literal darkness of Dr. Manhattan's color is being paralleled here by the more figurative darkness of these people coming into this creepy little corridor here. And so, all right, you guys are getting the idea. I could keep going, but I think you get the point, right? Right here, it says, believe me, in the upper right-hand corner, we really have something special for you tonight, as Laurie and Dan are about to experience something unusual, okay? And they start asking about Afghanistan. Will you be prepared to enter hostilities? In the bottom here, as Laurie and Dan are about to enter into hostilities. So, we're getting the point. But this is where Doug Roth comes in, as these ideas from the interview are paralleled in what is going on in this fight scene over here. And he basically accuses Dr. Manhattan of giving people around him cancer. And as these questions start to multiply, he kind of gets bombarded. He had no idea that his close friends, his old lovers, were getting cancer. Secret Service tries to get involved, says no more questions. The doctor's tired. Sorry about this, folks, but the show's over. Clearly, right as Dan and Laurie are finishing up their own show in and of itself, so on and so forth. As they keep going, Dr. Manhattan is feeling overwhelmed by these accusations, by people storming him or recording, and he says, please, if everybody would just go away and leave me alone, as both Laurie and Dan here kind of turned the opposite directions, seeming to feel a little bit alone or isolated. And then he shouts, I said, leave me alone. And notice how that desire to be alone is kind of paralleled with what Laurie and Dan are saying here. Laurie says, after that, Jesus, us getting mugged. Look, I'm shaken. Once the adrenaline wears off, I always feel sort of weird, sort of empty. And so that emptiness being, figuratively associated with that feeling of isolation or loneliness. And so as Lori continues, she says, I'm going to find a hotel and think my relationship over, see if I can come up with one good reason to stick around. As she's saying, let me see if I can come up with a reason to stick around with John. John obviously is also contemplating whether he has any reason to stick around with humanity. So, okay, that was all pretty long detour in terms of all of the specific details of the plot that's going on there. But notice that even when it's just kind of plot details, right? Alan Moore is just moving the plot along there. He does it brilliantly by paralleling so many things. Notice also some other little stuff. This is the New Frontiersmen billboard. Right, something in your hearts, it's right. Clearly, they're very patriotic, but someone graffitied, it's right wing, trying to accuse it of being a very biased source. Notice also 1980s, this was before the kind of partisanship and accusations of fake news or political bias that exists within the media today. But I think Alan Moore very presciently predicted the way that those things were going to go. And we'll see that much more as the graphic novel moves on, but certainly want to prime the pump to be aware of kind of the Nova Express versus the New Frontiersmen as two very different ways of approaching truth or approaching the news, right? Okay, and so Dan shows up and we find out, Dr. Manhattan disappeared. What's going on? And so notice, right after this point is where we get the Black Freighter again. And so you should be asking yourself, right, as we continue to try to chart the parallels that are going on within this chapter, what point is being made with the Black Freighter? And so we find out that right as this Nova Express is delivered with this news of the Dr. Manhattan evidence, news that we will soon find out causes Dr. Manhattan to leave Earth permanently, that is paralleled with what's going on in the Black Freighter, where it says the freighter's murderous onslaught had surprised us. So what is the parallel? The parallel should be pretty obvious. Whatever, and we learned this in the comedian chapter, that clearly Dr. Manhattan, there's some plot against Dr. Manhattan. We don't know exactly what. Maybe this was just an innocent reporter. But clearly the comedian was saying somehow Dr. Manhattan is wrapped up in this. Whatever led to this story being released, whatever caused Dr. Manhattan to leave, it was like a murderous onslaught of the freighter, clearly because it pushes humanity closer to the brink of extinction through the atomic situation. And said, we'd been blasted to fragments before we could warn Davidstown of the hell ship's approach. I alone survived upon my remote atoll. In the same way that everybody within this world doesn't quite realize all the implications of of this story, it is like the narrator of the Black Freighter ship being attacked without his hometown being warned of the larger danger that's looming. Again, you get more inversions here. Newspaper vendor saying, inside his ex says they couldn't relate sexually. That means he's queer as a $3 bill. Ruh-roh, some 1980s homophobia here. My wife, she'd fantasize about this creep. I suspected all along. So as the newspaper vendor is talking, is saying bad things about his wife, kind of degrading her in the way he's talking about her, you can see here that the narrator of the Black Freighter, a very different approach. He says, I thought of my family, vulnerable, unsuspecting. Also notice, by the way, that cars are electric within this world. They're being recharged. Alan Moore also prescient with the Tesla world future here, brought on by Dr. Manhattan. And you'll get more clues in the end chapter excerpt that Dr. Manhattan changed even the automobile industry. Let's keep going. So I thought of my family, vulnerable, unsuspecting, never dreaming that damnation bore down upon them. Sails pregnant with a pirate wind, a necklace of heads about its prow. Crazed with helplessness, I cursed God and wept, wondering if he wept also. But then what use his tears if his help was denied me? So now we're getting that connection to that question of theodicy. And notice here that it begins to rain, but the rain is like a tear. Again, a kind of repeated motif of something we saw from chapter 2 with the tears on the angel's face being teardrops. So the narrator of the Black Freighter, right? He is helpless. He has experienced a terrible atrocity. He curses God and wept, wondering if God is caring too. And then he wonders even a deeper question. It's not just does God care, but wait a second, even if God cares, what use is that if he's not helping me? God is supposed to be great and all-powerful. If there really was a higher power to this universe, something watching out for humanity, caring for humanity, giving us some sort of guidance or protection from evil, evil or from needless suffering, then why doesn't that power stop these types of atrocities? How can you justify or reconcile the existence, for instance, of a God with things like the coronavirus or atomic bombs being dropped or the Holocaust or horrific natural disasters? Some of you might say, oh, well, he gave us free will. But again, how do you justify that with things that are beyond our control, like the fires that burned down Paradise, California, like a hurricane that hit Katrina, so on and so forth, right? Now let's keep going. He said, my own sobbing had frightened the gulls. They departed. And in the terrible silence, I'm just reading the Black Freighter right now, I understood the true breadth of the word isolation. And so this is the core idea. If you understand the dilemma of theodicy, of if God is good and powerful and cares about humanity, why does God allow suffering and evil to exist within the world? That's the theological dilemma. And it raises one of two possibilities. Either option one is God exists and he sees everything that's happening, but he's not doing anything to stop it, which questions God's goodness, or you could question his power, right? Like maybe God isn't as all-powerful as we'd like to believe, and thus is he worth worshiping. Or second, the other problematic conclusion that you could come to is perhaps there is no higher power. Perhaps there is no God. Perhaps evil and needless suffering prove that we are cosmically isolated, that we are within a universe that is indifferent to our lives, to our suffering, to our success, right? If you become an Olympic gold medalist, or if you do absolutely nothing with your life, there perhaps is no cosmic power that cares. If you do only evil or you do good actions all the time, perhaps we are cosmically alone and it makes no difference. This is what that word isolation is getting at. And it's definitely used by the existentialists, especially Albert Camus and his philosophy of absurdism. He is absolutely saying that the tragedy of an indifferent universe is that man is isolated. We are isolated from any sort of cosmic source of meaning. And so that's what the idea of cosmic isolation means, and certainly something you should have in your notes. Notice how this is paralleled with the newspaper vendor. He's saying, right, the kid's like, lend me your cat, man, I'm getting wet. Newspaper vendor says, no chance, I don't lend things. It's my philosophy. Kid says, suit yourself, jive-ass. And newspaper vendor says, in this world, you shouldn't rely on help from anybody. In the end, a man stands alone. So he seems to be preaching here a kind of Emersonian sense of self-reliance, right? Pick yourself up by your bootstraps. Don't rely on anybody. Be independent. Be strong. And that is paralleled, obviously, in this deeper, more philosophical sense of isolation that is being discussed in the Black Freighter. So, okay, feels terrible. So as Dr. Manhattan comes, as they're putting a fallout shelter quarantine sign on his door for fear that he might be causing people cancer, the guy's like, oh man, I thought that you might be leaving. Sorry, Dr. Manhattan says, you can tell your superiors I'm leaving. And the guy's like, leaving? And he says, yes, for Arizona first, and then I think Mars. And the guy laughs. He's like, Doc, you had me going there. Ha ha ha, you know, you're a regular kind of guy. And as he says, you're a regular guy, obviously Dr. Manhattan teleporting away conveys that he's not a regular guy. And we find out he leaves. He goes, he grabs this picture of that's him and his first girlfriend, Janie Slater, in this kind of derelict. Again, this was at the old nuclear test site. We'll find out in chapter 4. Obviously, it had been destroyed by probably a nuclear test bomb. And then he decides to leave. Really sad images. You feel the sense of isolation. Hopefully you've noticed that there are many forms of physical isolation within this chapter, whether it's Lori feeling physically isolated, whether it's Dan feeling isolated, whether it's Janie Slater feeling isolated, whether it's Dr. Manhattan feeling isolated, or whether it's the narrator of the Black Freighter feeling isolated, and that all those forms of isolation are obviously getting at a much deeper, more philosophical form of cosmic isolation. And we see that picked up here as Dr. Manhattan leaves, kind of looking at the stars. Black Freighter says, that night I slept badly beneath cold, distant stars, pondering upon the cold, distant God in whose hands the fate of Davidstown rest. Was he really there? Had he been there once but now departed? Deep questions, dark questions, right? Is God cold and distant? Why doesn't God intervene in the affairs of mankind more often? If God really cared about us, wouldn't he be stopping us from doing evil? Wouldn't he be stopping disasters like pandemics from happening? Is he really there? Had he been there once, but now he's not there? These are the profound questions of theodicy. Let's continue. The morning sun found me no more wise, no less troubled. Further down the shore, several of the beach corpses had become inflated by gas. I'm just going to continue with the Black Freighter for now. I set about burying the sodden carcasses, matching odd limb as best I could with them. I buried all my hope for my family's survival. So the Black Freighter's narrator here is clearly getting a sense of apocalypticism in terms of his own town's ability to survive. And so you can see here, right, New Frontiersmen, by the way, notice Promethean Cab Company. Promethean, for those of you who have read Frankenstein, you should see the connection, Prometheus being the god that brings light to the world, dangers of pursuing knowledge, perhaps. It says bringing light to the world. We'll come back to that a little later. New Frontiersmen here says our country's protector smeared by the Kremlin, referring to Dr. Manhattan. And so they view it, again, conspiracy theories, as an inside job. And you see up here, Dr. Manhattan leaves Earth. Ruh-roh, right? This is clearly bad. Newspaper vendor says, sure, there you are. You know, I had it tagged for a red smear from the start. I'm a news vendor. Notice the newspaper vendor just tells anybody what he thinks they want to hear. He changes his views all the time. And he says, how about you? I see the world didn't end yesterday. And the end is not guy, the not so science guy says, are you sure? Obviously, an ominous question of perhaps the world is ending. And we just don't realize it, right? Perhaps this pushing us to the brink of nuclear apocalypse is actually bad. Let's keep going with the Black Freighter. Using driftwood, I began a pit deep and wide. I had never seen nor imagined so many dead people. Noon came and went. By dusk, the crater was deep enough, and I commenced hauling those cold, maimed, wretched things into the bed I had prepared. Dragging and cursing, I hoped my wife and daughters might be tucked in by gentler hands when their turn came. I began to weep again. Dear God, who would protect them? So, right, getting back to that question of theodicy, and Black Freighter says, the freighter was almost upon them. Who would care for them now that I was gone? And so he's raising a different question, which is, oh, shoot, if God, obviously it's ironic here, I began to weep again, dear God, who would protect them? The irony being, right, he has just questioned whether God is even there. Clearly, God is not watching over this world, and you can see that through this image of all the horrific corpses being put into this pit by the narrator of the Black Freighter. And he's now instead questioning, is the only thing that we have then is human action, right? For who will care for them now that I was gone? Clearly God's not going to. If I don't, who will? And so as we come in here, notice that transition. The Black Freighter said, who will care for them now that I'm gone? And the next word is gone, as Laurie is finding out that he left for Mars. A Secret Service guy in this bottom middle panel here says, listen, lady, if our psychologists are quite right, John is quite possibly never coming back. Your meal ticket has flown the coop. The linchpin of America's strategic superiority has apparently gone to Mars. The linchpin being like the most essential element of. Dr. Manhattan, we find out, dramatically tilted the scales of the Cold War in the favor of America, different than the world that we lived in, where it was a much closer competition for a lot longer than we would admit. But instead, in this world, America was on top. America prevented, for instance, Soviet Russia from invading Afghanistan, which had happened earlier than what happens in this particular comic book. And so this guy's saying we're all in big trouble, right? Rorschach comes back in. He had eaten some more raw stuff, stole some more of his food, grabbed some more of those sugar cubes. Anyways, obviously the joke is he broke Dan's lock again, feels terrible, and he's getting some more evidence for his mass killer or somebody being out for the mass heroes theory. Let's keep going. Back to the Black Freighter, we get the final one. And by the way, in this upper left-hand corner, we find out that in this world, superhero comics fell out of fad. That these days, it's all about the pirates. Pirates became the main superhero comic. I mean, you should think about it, right? Superheroes being a dominant genre is not something that was predestined to happen. We could have just as easily been living in a world where pirates were the main thing, or where, something else was equally as popular, but it just so happened that we really latched on to the superhero genre for reasons that I would argue were explained in Chapter 1, our kind of fascination of having that fantasy of moral clarity, the fantasy of being individuals who have significant power within the world to change the world, so on and so forth. Black Freighter. Exhausted, I slept atop the grave, dreams ringing with the horribly familiar screams of children. I saw the Black Freighter bearing down on all I loved, but I was powerless to stop it. So the Black Freighter becomes a good symbol for those horrific atrocities that occur within the world that are unexplainable, that raise that question of theodicy and raise thus the possibility of our cosmic isolation from some sort of divine higher power watching out for us. Like I've mentioned before, it's very easy to believe that there's some sort of higher power or divine force when everything's going well, right? Like think of last semester, just flowers and sunshine, the beautiful quad of your school campus, so on and so forth. Right? But now think of everything now, everything being shut down, a real sense of fear and desolation. Once you have the metaphorical Black Freighter take down your metaphorical ship, you will be left asking those same questions, I think is something that's being asked here. Okay, as the newspaper vendor reads here that Russia invades Afghanistan, notice his dramatic reversal of his previous idea that everyone should just rely on themselves, and he gives the boy the cap, and he says, hey, you can have my cap too. Listen, you go home to your mom, okay? You be good to her. I mean, we all got to look out for each other, don't we? I mean, that's my philosophy. The kid's like, sure, thanks for the stuff, man. Listen, I got to go. You take care. Yeah, you too. And don't worry about paying for that book. I mean, life's too short in a final analysis. So this is raising another idea that, holy shoot, the newspaper vendor is finally realizing, right, the potential for a Black Freighter to rage through his own society in the version of a nuclear apocalypse. And that without any sort of higher power watching over us, perhaps all we have is to be compassionate towards each other. Let's keep going. And so now we get the scene with Richard Nixon and his advisors, and they are talking about very, very bleak prognosis of what will potentially happen if war with Russia breaks out. Obviously, you see this joke here. If he had wanted to live on a red planet, he should have stayed home, saying like it's going to descend into bloodshed. They're talking about their chances of first striking Russia, but still they're talking total devastation. You're seeing these images contrasted with Dr. Manhattan. And as they're talking about the scenarios that would occur, you see here that basically huge parts of the world would be destroyed, even if the U.S. tried to strike Russia first with everything they had. And you see Nixon saying, I'd always kind of hoped that the big decision would rest with somebody else, i.e. like some sort of higher power or a different president. This is going to take some thinking about. It's like old naval battles. So much depends upon a quirk of the wind. The wind's a force of nature. It's totally impartial, totally indifferent. And that's that core kind of existentialist Albert Camusian idea of the indifference of the universe, that we live in a universe that is full of impartial forces, that perhaps just like the wind, the entire universe is an indifferent, impartial force without any sort of cosmic higher power watching over us, caring for us, preventing terrible things from happening. And he says, I think we'll give it a week, gentlemen, before bringing out our big guns. After that, humanity is in the hands of a higher authority than mine. Let's just hope he's on our side. And then we see Dr. Manhattan, obviously an image, again, I think this really conveys the sense of isolation that's been evoked throughout this chapter. And we can see that the closest thing we have to a God within this world seems completely cosmically separated from humanity insofar as he's literally on a different planet and he's all alone. And then we get this great quote from Genesis chapter 18, verse 25, that says, shall not the judge of all the earth do right? Clearly asking, is there a righteous and just God in the world? Is there a higher power that will watch over us? Chapter 18 of Genesis, definitely super interesting, and you should check it out, really short. But it's Abraham, actually, he asks this question directly to God, and it's when he finds out that God is going to destroy the city of Sodom and Gomorrah. Sodom and Gomorrah and that destruction often being used in literature as a parallel for the specter of atomic annihilation. Certainly in Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five, if any of you read that last year, if you remember at the end of chapter 1, Vonnegut references Sodom and Gomorrah as being a parallel for the destruction of Dresden. So anyways, what happens in this chapter? Well, Abraham finds out that God is potentially going to destroy the city of Sodom and Gomorrah, and he begs God and he says, wait a second, aren't there righteous people in Sodom and Gomorrah? Yeah, there might be evil people, but are you going to kill the good people too? And God says, if there are, I think he says 50 people here. Hold on, we could pull it up. So, all right. He says their sins are so grievous. And so the Lord said, if I find 50 righteous people in the city of Sodom, I will spare the whole place. Then Abraham spoke up. Now that I've been so bold as to speak, what if the number of the righteous is 5 less than 50? Will you destroy the whole city for lack of 5 people? If I find 45 there, he said, I will not destroy it. Once again, he spoke, what if only 40 are found there? So he keeps going on, and he gets to 10. He gets him to the lowest denominator, right? He's like, for the sake of 10, I will not destroy it. When the Lord had finished speaking with Abraham, he left, and Abraham returned home. But obviously, you guys know what happens in chapter 19. God destroys the city of Sodom and Gomorrah, raising a number of troubling questions, right? Perhaps is humanity so depraved that we are being punished by God, which doesn't seem great. That kind of links to the comedian chapter that all of our pretensions to goodness are a joke, and thus us being murdered isn't such a terrible thing. Or is God's sense of justice or righteousness something that is so far beyond our own comprehension that we'll never be able to understand it? I mean, that's not great either, right? If God is so mysterious that we cannot understand his modes of righteousness or justice, and thus we will never be able to believe in a God that cares for us in the way that we understand what the concept of caring or righteousness means, that's not good. Or 3, is God just not there at all? And all of this is paralleled, I think, in the end chapter excerpt, right? You get this real bleak sense. And this is the final under the hood excerpt. You'll see after this point, we start getting different excerpts from different works. But here, Hollis Mason opens up, right? He says the Minutemen didn't get to usher in the 1950s with a Christmas celebration the way we'd ushered in the 1940s, and perhaps that's appropriate. The decade following the disbanding of the group was cold and bleak, both for me in particular and for mass adventurers in general. Plus, it seemed to go on forever. So we're seeing here, right off the bat, that there is a sense of pessimism in these later days of the original Minutemen. And there's a sense that, the optimism of that earlier time is leaving. And he says... Here, hold on. Let me turn on my mouse again so I can point it out. He says he recognized that the day of the costumed hero was over. So those good old days that led to that optimism, that fantasy of moral clarity are disappearing. Notice here is he says the thing about that decade is that things started getting serious. I remember thinking at that time that it was funny how the more serious things got, the better the comedian seemed to do. Now, we understand why this is, right? The comedian is a reflection of the horrific things that humanity is capable of. Thus, it makes sense that he does better in those times. And what I think he means by serious here, he's going to talk about the advent of the Cold War. Yes, World War II was incredibly serious. It was horrific. But yet, as I'll explain in just a moment, there was moral clarity there. Moreover, the entire extinction of the human race didn't seem to be a remote possibility. But as the 1950s goes on and the nuclear stockpile race heats up, we find out that what he means by serious is like, holy cow, we might be actually capable of destroying ourselves now, which is much more horrific than anything that came before. We see the McCarthy era. You guys have learned about McCarthyism in your American history classes, hopefully, kind of witch trials to root out communists. You find out some interesting details there. But let's keep going. So you find out some details about the masked heroes. There's a great line down here that I think really undermines a lot of what Hollis Mason had said in earlier chapters about their pretensions to try to create values of good and evil. And he admits, right, real life is messy, inconsistent, and it's seldom when anything ever really gets resolved. That notion of moral clarity, of moral closure, doesn't really exist, right? And Hollis Mason is admitting that. And over here, I think we get some good evidence that parallels very well the themes of the chapter. All the cases I ended up investigating during the 50s seem sordid and depressing and quite often blood-chillingly horrible. So notice that sense of seriousness. I don't know what it was. There just seemed to be a sort of bleak, uneasy feeling in the air. It's as if some essential element of our lives, of all of our lives, was vanishing before we knew entirely what it was. A good symbol for kind of modernity erasing the moral clarity of the past. I don't think I could really describe it completely, except maybe to someone who remembered the terrific elation we felt after the war. We felt we'd taken the worst that the 20th century could throw at us and stood our ground. We felt as if we'd really won a hard-earned age of peace and prosperity that would see us well into the year 2000. This optimism lasted through the 40s and the 50s, but by the middle of that latter decade, it was starting to wear thin, and there was a sort of ominous feeling in the air. So why is World War II so much better than the Cold War? Well, in World War II, there was moral clarity. And the reason why there's so many video games and movies and documentaries on World War II from the American perspective is because it's the war where there was absolutely no question about what was right and what was wrong, right? The Nazis were committing a horrific genocide. The Japanese were doing horrific things across the Asia-Pacific region. And so, of course, it makes sense when there is literal genocide going on, when the entire free world is at stake with an evil, crazy dictator. It makes sense that you have to stand up to that, right? That you have to go to war against that. And so there was moral clarity there. But obviously, the wars after that become a lot more morally ambiguous. And that's the kind of world we're living in the world of theodicy, in the world of cosmic isolation. There's ambiguity. The Korean War, obviously the Vietnam War. These things are not black and white. These things do not have clear justifications of whether they're good or bad, And let's keep going. With all these sudden upheavals, just when we thought we'd gotten everything straight, it was impossible to live through the 1950s without a sense of impending catastrophe bearing implacably down upon the whole country, the whole world. Hopefully you see that sense of impending catastrophe being paralleled in the Black Freighter, within the world of Watchmen, with the invasion of Russia and the heating up of the atomic situation, and of course what's going on here, right? All these raising questions of theodicy. So I think that's a pretty good place to start. The final thing that Hollis Mason ends on is noting that the idea that they've been replaced by Dr. Manhattan, right? He says right here, we've been replaced and they have been made obsolete. And that's ultimately why he ends up retiring, is that sense of obsolescence. But we had already analyzed that through the sign outside of his house. So we were already cued into that truth. So guys, heavy chapter. Hopefully you're appreciating the themes that Alan Moore is presenting to us. I think these opening chapters especially are presenting a bleak vision of the universe. And the question is whether we can dig ourselves out of this, right? Whether we can find any sort of meaning despite these questions of the depravity of mankind, of the potential for cosmic isolation, or the questions of theodicy, whether we can find something to affirm within this world. And my hope by the end of this journey is to actually get there. I think Watchmen will bring us there, albeit it is not afraid to look at the darker aspects of existence for sure. Also, I hope you're beginning to appreciate just how artistically nuanced and complex Alan Moore is. I think he's bringing so much to the table. Of course, I should give shout outs to Dave Gibbons as well, the artist, but Alan Moore very closely directs his artists, and it's so clear in every work that he does that he has such a vision for what he's doing, and he creates so many parallels and inversions that are just so fun to explore, and there are always new Easter eggs there to find. So hopefully you guys are enjoying this. I look forward to discussing Chapter 4 with you, Dr. Manhattan's chapter, very soon.